So Faye, my first question for you today is, what do you think it means to connect the dots in an IEP, and why is that an important consideration?
So let me first say thank you for asking me to come talk about this topic, because although people may not think of IEPs as the most exciting topic in the world, I actually think when they're done well, they can be meaningful, and I don't know if exciting is the right word, but can really serve an important purpose.
Right.
So when I think about connecting the dots in an IEP, and please know I read many, many IEPs every day.
Every week.
That's right, every day, every week, every year. I think of it much like reading a book. Because not everybody in the world reads an IEP, so that doesn't necessarily have meaning to most people. Most people read a book. So when you read a book, it's always helpful, at least for me when I read a book, that early on in the book I'm captured by it. I say, wow, this is something that I want to read more about.
Yeah.
And when I read the different parts of the book, it needs to come alive. It needs to make sense to me, so that I'm drawing a picture of who are the characters in the book, what do they do, and just it needs to have meaning and come alive, so that once I finish that book, I hold on to it. I say, I remember that book. This has meaning. I know what to do. I know how it connects to other things. And I think of an IEP as much the same way. So if I'm reading an IEP, I want to say, I know who that student is. I know what they're good at, what they like, what their interests are, what they hope and what they're trying to achieve, and also what are the areas that they're struggling with and how to make that be better for them.
Oh,
So I
that's
don't know if that
great.
makes sense,
Yeah.
but that's my sense.
Yeah, and I think if IEPs were written that way, as we read them, we would be able to assign meaning to what's in them in a way that really helps us to know what to do with kids, you know?
Right. And for those people who are reading them, for them to remember it.
Right.
Because no teacher is walking around carrying that IEP with them all the time.
Right.
And so we want them to remember it, and I want a family or a student, when they read that document, to feel like it speaks to them about either who their child is, or if it's a student, who they are.
Yeah, that's really great, and I do think you're right, because if we can't remember what these IEPs say, it's difficult for us to have the fluency that we need as educators to do the work.
Right.
So as a special ed administrator, you talked about reading a lot of IEPs, and I know you do. What do you think are maybe 3 elements that might be critical to creating this kind of IEP that you're describing that tells the story of a child?
So it was helpful that you asked for only 3, because one could go on a long time with that. And so I spent some time really thinking, so 3 elements, what would those be? And I think the first one is there needs to be voice. We want to know the student, no matter what the age of that student is, the student's vision, what they're hoping for, what their hopes and dreams are for education, as well as from the family. So I think that part being clearly articulated and making sure it's specifically named in the beginning of the IEP kind of sets the stage. After that, I do think that we as educators, if we're going to provide whatever services are indicated, that we need to name what is the disability. And not just a word, not just kind of something out of the regulations, but name what that disability is and how that disability for that individual student affects them in the general education environment. Because there's only a finite amount of disabilities, but there's many, many students, and what a disability looks like in one student and what we need to do for one student may be different than for the other. So that would be the second one.
Yeah.
And then I think as we get longer on in the story and we're further at the end, we want to make sure that the goals and the benchmarks, what we want that student to be working on in this 1-year period of time for the IEP, how is that measurable? How is that specific? And really name that clearly so that everybody can be in this together and working as a team on those different goals.
Yeah, and I remember you have often said to me this idea of the thread that runs through those elements, where it's really explicit how the vision the disability and the way it affects progress and the goal, the things that we're choosing to work on and look at,
Right.
connect,
That's right. It should be that if you pick up the IEP and read any one portion of it, if you go backwards or forwards to a part outside of that one part, you should say, yes, that makes sense.
Right.
Of course it said that there because it says this here. So you really should feel like you're just moving right along, the same way when you're reading a book.
Right,
That
right.
it should be, yes, this is the next chapter I should be reading. It makes sense for this
Yeah,
to be
it
there.
fits, right?
Yes.